Hi, I'm Josh. Welcome to Dialectical Violence. If you're a returning viewer, thank you. Nice to see you here again. And if you're a first time viewer, I hope that you enjoy the discussion that we have. Check out some of my other videos, like and subscribe to those. That would be awesome. So, you guys may have noticed that today it's going to be an audio only episode. The reason being is that I do have some videos that are in the work that do have a lot of video editing involved. And I also thought, well, I can have a discussion about something here that doesn't necessarily require a lot of sort of visual aids or anything to go over. So the subject of today's topic is the GFL, but also influencer boxing. I wanted to talk about how we've got an emergent league here that's largely going to be trading off of old names, and how also the sport of boxing has changed slightly in that there's now platforms for a lot of these sort of circus matches, often which involve older fighters. So, to get started, talk about the GFL. It's pretty notorious at the moment that the majority of the people that are signed to the GFL, that are big names, are fighters that really haven't been relevant for a long time. A lot of them are old favorites. A lot of them are fighters that we absolutely love. But basically, we got a bunch of prehistoric pugilists. It's looking like the Mesozoic out here. There's been a lot of fun made about their name, Global Fight League, Grandpa Fight League, Glue Factory League, so on and so forth. Um, but, is it a good thing? Is it a good thing that these fighters that have sort of aged past their ability to compete in the large organizations, is it good that there's this other place for them? Is it bad? Does it even matter because it's their decision? That's really up for everyone to decide on their own. But I did want to mention a couple of things that I find a little bit disconcerting about the GFL. So, first of all, it really, really strikes me as a sort of venture capital project, which shouldn't really be a surprise given that it seems to have as far as if I am correct, it has a private equity firm known as Blackstone that's attached to it. Um, the thing is we're gonna see a lot of this in the MMA and combat sports space in general at the moment, because you've got the UFC constantly making these record profits. They've got a model that obviously works in terms of being fiscally viable. And as such, there's going to be other people that want to replicate that. They go, oh, well, it's the UFC. We can do what the UFC does, or we can change up the formula a little bit to make a distinct product and then make those kind of profits. Where there's a big problem with that is that it makes a whole number of assumptions about mixed martial arts as a spectator sport that don't really apply to other sports. So people can come and going, oh, well, I've got a lot of experience in dealing with these sports, with these stick and ball sports in particular, and I'm just going to apply that expertise to the GFL. Now, the GFL's chief operating officer, Arun Parimi, is also the CEO of a company called Big B AI and another company called Combat Plus. So Big B AI, as its name suggests, is an artificial intelligence company, and Combat Plus is actually seems to be something akin to a streaming service. Anyway, it's some sort of platform to provide provide a platform for things to be viewed. So it seems that the GFL would preferentially want to get in bed with a big streaming partner. They won't, but let's say Netflix, for instance. But I guess Combat Plus is sort of the fallback if nothing eventuates on that front. Parimi's AI company, Big B, has been described by him as focused on the development of quote-unquote technology solutions for sports media and entertainment. What that actually entails, I couldn't really find out. Like a lot of these kind of guys, it seems to be that what exactly they do is shrouded in a whole bunch of just, jargon and sort of weasel words that make them sound like they do a whole bunch of stuff without even explaining any of it. And then if, you ask any further questions, they just say, oh, well, it's too complicated for you to understand in the first place. Trust the technology kind of thing. I think it's pretty clear that regardless of how the GFL goes, Parimi is probably set to win out of this, in terms that he has an AI company, and as we saw by the GFL's pretty tasteless trailer that was just absolutely bizarre, with these poor quality AI sort of deep fakes of fighters and, the ant. like, um, is that, the AI that Parimi's company makes is going to be contributing somewhat to the product, and therefore there's probably going to be a whole bunch of money getting pushed across from the GFL to Big B AI, and probably Combat Plus as well, especially if they can't find a big streamer, which is very likely at the beginning. They are supposed to be showing their event according to their own schedule. Their first event is supposed to be in April. I'm recording this at the very end of March, and there is no announcement about where they're going to be, how to watch GFL. But anyways, Parimi's synergizing his endeavors, so no doubt he'll make a bit of money off of that. And then the other sort of notable person here is the acting commissioner, Darren Owen, who seems to be sort of taking the Dana White position of being the face of the company at the moment. He's had some interviews on Hawani's show and so on, and he was also hosting the draft. So, yeah, I mean, are these guys serious? I think at least in Owen's case, he probably does legitimately want to make a good product. Apparently, he was on, I believe, the Canadian version of Dragon's Den years back, trying to pull together capital for a regional MMA promotion that was far smaller in scope than the GFL is. So he clearly has been wanting to get into this industry. How successful it will be is yet to be known. But he's clearly in bed with some people that are happy to turn this into a quick smash and grab and just funnel all the investment away if that's what comes to it. The reason I don't think that the GFL is actually going to last very long, or even get, frankly, to the point where the PFL got to, let alone a Bellator or a Strikeforce, is that there seems to be within that company a fundamental misunderstanding of the consumption patterns of MMA fans. First of all, they've got all these old names. You got Fabricio Verdum, you got Tyron Woodley, Junior Dos Santos, Alexander Gustafsson, you got Henan Barao, you got Benson Henderson. You got all these people that had really big profiles and big achievements in the UFC of yesteryear, but they're not relevant. I mean, in the sense that they aren't capable of competing at the very highest levels of sport anymore. And then further, because there is constantly an influx of new fans, there are increasingly going to be a lot of MMA fans that just remember Gustafsson as, that was that guy that nearly had a win against John Jones that many years ago that they've seen on YouTube. You're not getting people that actually have an emotional attachment to these fighters as they develop. And, for some of us that have been fans for a long time, that may seem kind of sad, but it's just the nature of sports in general, Frank Mir isn't that far away from being remembered in the same way as like Kevin Randleman, where people can be like, oh yeah, that guy had some cool fights, but no one, like maybe 10% of the fan base actually watch them fight in their prime and have an emotional attachment to the moments that they had in triumph, right? So I think they're misunderstanding that. They're going, okay, we're getting all these people that are former champion, this, that. And really most of them aren't particularly relevant at the moment. A lot of them are really shop-worn. I mean, I'm a little worried for Alexander Gustafsson, Frankly, he was a really, really great fighter. Obviously, he then had a pretty rapid decline, took some time off, came back, looked really bad against Verdum, took more time off, came back at light heavyweight, thought, okay, he's not fat like he was coming back at heavyweight. Maybe he's taking this more seriously. Maybe there's something. No, immediately just gets flatlined by Nikita Krylov, So his durability is obviously not there anymore. So then it becomes an issue of like, how bad are these people going to actually be hurt? Like, I know they're fighting other old guys, but particularly with the heavyweights and the light heavyweights, they're still capable of doing real damage to each other. But even beyond that, did people not realize from the PFL that this whole point system is kind of dumb? And then on top of it, you're going to add a team system to it. And not only are you going to add a team system, you're going to do the ridiculous sort of stick and ball sport style city teams, which works for that kind of format. Don't get me wrong. You can have the, you can have like the New York Knicks or whatever. And, people are tied to these particular stadiums and they go and watch at these venues and they have their different guys. And some of them are from other parts of of America or from other parts of the world, and they're brought over, and they're sort of made for that to be their new home, and there's a connection there, and there's a connection in the social fabric. There isn't that in MMA. I mean, fundamentally, it's an individual sport because you're only in the cage against your opponent, just like boxing is. And boxing's also another one that's not really that heavily localized. I don't think with combat sports that's necessarily the case. And also with MMA fans in particular, I think a lot gets made about MMA fans being reactionary or racist or having some sort of weird political hang-ups. And there are some people that are like that in the sport, don't get me wrong. But also, I actually don't think that MMA fighters are particularly nationalistic. Not as much as boxing fans tend to be, and certainly not as much as other sports fans tend to be. I'll often see guys just rooting. Look at how many Dagestan fans there are. There are so many more Dagestan fans than there are Dagestanis that watch MMA, because people will look at a particular fighter or a particular style of fighting and go, oh yeah, I really, really like that. And then they're like anything that's sort of associated with that. And that doesn't have to be a person from their hometown. And often they will turn pretty heavily on someone from their own country or their own city if they fight in a way that they deem cowardly. There seems to be this overarching value system amongst a lot of MMA fighters that supersedes ties of sort of nationality or of regionalism or parochialism. And then, if you were to do a team system, you should do it based on gyms, have team ATT, have team AKA, because then at least it's guys that have trained together and they have some sort of bond from being in the same training room. Not just like, oh, we're going to have team Sao Paulo and we're randomly going to have like a bunch of Argentinians and an Ecuadorian and a bunch of Brazilians and pretend they're all the same, which is, funnily enough, kind of seems a little bit like a North American attitude to be like, oh yeah, they're all the same kind of thing, all those were guys down there. But anyways, yeah, I also really don't like these point systems for MMA. The idea of 4 points for a finish, 3 for decision, 2 for draw, 1 for decision loss, and 0 for finish. And the reason being is that obviously we have a point system for the actual fights, for the scoring of the fights, because if you made every fighter fight to the finish, you'd end up having these massive problems with the broadcasting. So you'd have these also absurdly short careers for some of the fighters. Like some of the punishment they would be taking. Some of these guys are really, really tough and won't get themselves out of a bad situation. And you don't want to see them taking 45 minutes of consistent punishment. I know we like violence as fans, but there's a level. But also, part of the drama of MMA and of boxing and kickboxing too, and this is also again part of the reason why striking sports tend to be more popular than grappling sports amongst spectators, is that there's always a sudden possibility of a turnaround. If you're at a sports game and your team is 40 points behind, you might just go, hey, I know what the outcome is here. We're not going to make it up. I'm going to go get in the car, go home, beat the traffic, right? But in MMA, you can't do that, really. I know people do, but you can have last second comebacks. You can knock out a guy with 1 second left on the clock. I mean, look at Derek Lewis versus Alexander Volkov. He got a hiding for the better part of 3 rounds, and then with 10 seconds left, knocked Volkov unconscious, and then Derek Lewis got a title shot off of it. So you can have these massive swing moments that have huge consequence. And if it's like, oh, well, Team New York's behind 15 points, it doesn't matter if, Weidman knocks Rockhold out or not in terms of who wins or the season or whatever, then you're kind of asking the fans, well, you already got these shot-born fighters that we've seen in their primes, expecting us to watch them not in their primes, and it's often going to be in situations where it doesn't even matter for their winning of the competition, like where there's no actual outcome of any importance past the fight. It just doesn't seem like a recipe for success to me. So I think it's worth having a little conversation about why once great fighters end up in these kind of B-league situations in the first place. And I mean, obviously a lot of it comes down to money, right? This is professional fighters' jobs. That's why they say they're a professional fighter. They're a pro. They're someone that gets paid for their expertise and their ability. But, I'm not going to be so dismissive as, some people just go, oh, well, fighters, they're guys that get hit in the head for a living. Like, you expect them to be very smart. But to be actually realistic about it, there are a lot of people that, don't have a lot of financial literacy. Maybe they have some really tough circumstances, and that's what pushed them into fighting in the first place. And maybe they have a higher sort of unavoidable expenditure than some people, a family member that has really serious health problems that they need to cover or whatever. And particularly in MMA, this isn't a particularly high income sport in the first place. I mean, I know obviously you've got your Ronda Rouseys and your McGregors that are sort of outlier cases, but they made a lot more money for the UFC than they made themselves, right? And, you've got a situation now where John Jones, for all the very legitimate criticism of him, is undoubtedly one of the greatest fighters to have ever competed. And he's struggling to get $30 million out of this multi-billion-dollar company to fight Tom Aspinall when, Deontay Wilder would get that for fighting Joseph Parker. And you can't deny that there is a hell of a lot more interest in a Jones versus Aspinall than there was for a Wilder versus Parker, So you're in this situation where, because the UFC is the market leader and they don't want to establish a precedent of paying well, they don't pay very well. And then some of these other companies will try to go, okay, well, we can pay a little bit higher than the UFC, or we can give you more liberal contracts than the UFC. But then they're unable to keep it up because they don't have that revenue stream because of that monopsony power that the UFC has. So you've got these low incomes, which really come down to, for the most part, promotional greed and leverage. Like, obviously not every MMA fighter is going to get paid like crazy money, but you've got much lower purses at the higher level than boxing. You've got a big hindrance on sponsorship money because obviously MMA fighters, they can go and be in an ad for a mattress warehouse or something, but they can't have logos on their shorts anymore. They can't have the banners behind them when they do their walk-ins anymore, which were really, really good for that sort of 15 to top 5 sort of level of guy, or like people that had a cult following, your Roy Nelson, stuff like that, who could pay for advertising space because they were must-watch fighters, even if they weren't championship material. So you've taken that potential source of income away from them. You're not paying them particularly very well. A lot of it's people that have a lack of financial literacy, or some of them just have scummy managers that also exploit it, and in some cases actually actively conspire with the UFC in order to limit the purses of their fighters, or go, yeah, hey, you pay them a little bit more, but I will make sure they fight this matchup that's not good for them, but it's good for the manager's pocketbook. Because the athletic prime links up with a time in their lives where a lot of other people might be at college, or they would be in the years where they're developing a skill in the workplace that is going to be the foundation of their careers, these athletes miss out on that. And then by the time that they're retired, they really haven't got any experience doing anything other than fighting. And, it's probably pretty sad, but there's probably a lot of companies that go, okay, well, you're a guy that hasn't had a professional job for 20 years and you spent the last 20 years beating up people in a cage. Like, I don't know if I want to employ you. That sounds kind of scary, sharing the office with that guy. So, you end up in a situation where a lot of these MMA fighters, they got families to feed, maybe they got debts, maybe they tried to open a restaurant or tried to open some other business and it just didn't work out for them, as it often does for people with small businesses. So, MMA fighters are particularly prone to ending up in these kind of situations. And that's why you've seen guys like Tyron Woodley, who was, actually a really great champion. I know people like to sort of make fun of him now, but in his prime and even in his post-prime, he was legitimately a really, really good fighter, even though he had a tough run there at the end. And, going into going into the boxing ring basically knowing he's going to get smashed by a YouTuber, but doing it because he needs a bunch of money. Because he tried to do a couple of things. He tried to make a rap album. He tried to do some other stuff, and it didn't work out for him, and he needed the money. He got the money, good for him, but he'd be getting a lot more money from that Jake Paul fight than most of these GFL guys will be getting. So, yeah. And there's nowhere that really this whole phenomenon is more vulgar than in influencer boxing. I mean, in a weird way, influencer boxing has actually been quite good for boxing. I mean, we're sort of in this new golden era, which I suspect will actually turn out to be a little bit of a mirage once Turkey Al-Sheikh actually changes up the whole structure of the economic structure of the boxing industry, even though it, at least in the short term, has given us a lot of good fights. But I'm sort of getting off track here. The influencer boxing part that reignited a lot of interest in boxing amongst, wide audiences was really pushed by the Paul brothers and especially Jake Paul, right? You had him fighting YouTubers, then you had him fighting over the hill small MMA fighters, and then more over the hill and slightly larger MMA fighters, and then really, really bad boxers like Tommy Fury, and then you had him in a situation where he fought, an ancient legend and Mike Tyson. And there was a point, when Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr. happened as an exhibition, where I was like, this is not that bad, Like, they're both old, they're not going to hurt each other, they respect each other, this is something that's sort of acceptable, right? Like, if you're a kind of person that only really is interested in seeing them in their primes and you find it a little bit depressing that they've fallen behind, then you don't have to tune in. But at least it's something sort of appropriate where it doesn't feel as disgusting as and exploitative as some of the others. But, then you had Vitor Belfort versus Evander Holyfield, and to me, that's just really, really disgusting. I mean, Evander Holyfield is one of my favorite boxers of all time, but he was in some absolutely massive wars. You can tell it took a toll on him. I almost tear up anytime I hear him in an interview. And then you put him in there with Vitor Belfort, who, again, maybe past it, but nowhere near as old as Evander Holyfield. And he's back on the TRT. Thank God it was a boxing match and there wasn't kicks allowed in that fight. And also, thankfully, the referee was onto it straight away. Basically, you could tell the referee didn't even think that fight should go ahead. Got in there and saved Evander immediately, which was great to see. But that, the fact of the matter is someone put that fight together going, we don't care if Evander Holyfield gets flatlined in a really ugly way. That frankly is dangerous given the condition of his brain. He shouldn't be fighting at all. And enough people didn't care for that fight to go along and be made. And then you had the absolutely disgusting display that was Tyson versus Paul, which not only was like a disgusting exploitative fight, but actually did something that was probably more damaging for influencer boxing than anything else, which is that no one cared. People cared in terms of tuning in. It was a mass success in that respect, but if Jake Paul had gone in there and just immediately knocked out Mike Tyson, sure, he might have had to, boost his security detail for the next couple of months, but people would have felt something. And his whole deal, and these Paul brothers' whole deal, has always been about making people feel something. For the most part, that's hate, but it's feeling something. It's getting a response, A lot of people did that. I mean, look at Floyd Mayweather. Floyd Mayweather, obviously an absolutely fantastic boxer, but the reason he was paid so much is because people were tuning in to watch him lose. And he kept not doing it. So he had to tune into the next one hoping he'd lose that. And he just kept making more and more money off of it. So, yeah, there is a vulgarity to this influencer boxing and the sort of hate watching associating with it. But whether that will last, I don't think so. I think it's pretty much nearing the end of its run. I don't think there's any sort of compelling people to be the lightning rod for people's hate once the Paul brothers stop doing this. And I mean, it does seem like Logan Paul doesn't even really want to do it. Jake Paul does seem to, but how long he wants to stay in there, who knows? Probably just fight until he gets knocked out, and then when he knocks out, take the bag and run. And fair enough. But are we even going to have, stars in 20 years for people to actually tune in to these kind of things? You know, are we going to have the kind of people that people want to see in 20 years? Are we going to have these old legends, or is the structure of the sport changing so much that that's pretty much going away? I mean, there's been a lot of discourse recently around the MMA media sphere about, you know, does the UFC have a star problem? And I don't think really it's a good characterization to say that it's a problem, in a sense. I mean, I think it's a problem for fans. It's a problem for the UFC media, especially the sort of professional media, rather than people like me that are just doing YouTube stuff, or people that have podcasts on Spotify or whatever. But I think, you know, the UFC has actively tried to make the UFC itself its brand. And I think they do understand that when you have stars like a Conor McGregor or Ronda Rousey, or even more modest stars but who have moved the needle a lot, like more recently Alex Pereira, it does bring a lot of value and interest to the product and helps bring new people into the product. But I think they've been targeting a sort of approach where it's not, hey, look at the story of these fighters, look at what they've been through, look at what journeys they've taken to get there, look at the challenges they've had to overcome. Instead, it's more like, hey, you want to see some guys like have a scrap on TV? Like, you can watch the UFC, man. There's always guys getting like head kicked or like choked out or like slammed on their head. Like, you got to tune in for this, bro. And that's not something that's really feasible for long-term viewers, but, you know, they have analytics divisions and they look over their numbers, and maybe they've come to the conclusion that that's not what they need. Because if there's one thing that is very clear that the UFC doesn't want, is they don't want people to have leverage over them. I mean, that goes for money, but also goes for the matchmaking. We can look at Ilia Topuria, relinquished the featherweight strap, has gone up to lightweight, wanted to get an immediate fight with Islam Makhachev. Looks like he's not going to get it, and now he's basically having to manufacture beef with all the top lightweights, trying to get one top fiver to fight him. Target number one at the moment seems to be Charles Oliveira. So what they've done is, the UFC, you know, if they wanted to make stars, they would give Ilia Topuria the Islam Makhachev fight. They go, this guy's undefeated. He's a huge prospect. Well, not a prospect. He's a champion. He's undefeated. He's knocked out 2 of the 3 best featherweights to ever do it, including Max Holloway, never even really been dropped, and just like he put him out. You know, and he has contenders in his featherweight division, but they still need time to sort of get a little bit of a name for themselves. We'll see what happens with Diego Lopez against Volkanovski soon enough, but they would just throw him at Islam Makhachev if they were like, okay, let's make a star, because who cares that he's a featherweight? You go, Makhachev, if Makhachev beats him, it's a bigger win than anyone else in the top 5 at lightweight that he hasn't already beaten, because he's already got wins over Charles Oliveira and Arman Tsarukyan. And it's a guy that has the momentum of a runaway freight train and has never been defeated. And then on the other hand, you go, okay, well, Ilia Topuria is a massive puncher, and Islam Makhachev has 1 loss, and it's him getting chinned by a guy that just caught him. So there's a chance that Ilia could replicate that. You got the double champ thing going on, and it's to the moon. But what the UFC doesn't like is that Ilia Topuria took unilateral action, and then they had to scramble around him, and they don't like having to do that. They want to dictate the terms on everything. That's why the roster's bloated, because they want a reserve army of labor, of people that they can just slot in when, you know, space on a card fall out. And that's why they have the Contender Series, so they can sign guys on 12 and 12 contracts that are, you know, 22 years old, that just go, yeah, bro, it's always been my dream to be in the UFC, and can't conceive of a future where they're not the champion, which is frankly going to be the most likely outcome. And then they've just sacrificed a whole bunch of, like, they've taken a whole bunch of damage, injured themselves a million times at the gym. For what? For nothing? And you're telling me these guys can't even have a banner behind them to, like, sell 10 seconds of screen time to, like, Turtle Wax or something? It's frankly a big problem, and I'm not trying to be really negative in this podcast episode. I just wanted to sort of share my thoughts on it. And I do think that we are going to get to the point where, whether it's with Dana at the helm or not, where the UFC is going to change its approach and we're going to have more stars in the sport again. I do think it will turn around, but I think it will take a while. And the GFL certainly not going to make any new ones. I mean, at least with Bellator and the PFL, you had some guys that hadn't competed in the UFC where you could go, oh, I wonder how Vadim Nemkov would do against the top 5 at light heavyweight. I mean, he'd certainly do better than Olberg by the looks of it, but, it is what it is. So for those of you that have stuck around for this long, sorry if it was a little bit boring and a little bit rambly. It's something new that I'm trying. I'm sort of intending to get an audio episode out, and then next week have a video episode, and then sort of do alternating weeks between audio and video, because it's a lot easier for me to have these audio ones. It allows me to delve into topics that I don't need the visual aids for, but I do still want to make that high level analysis and to sort of do the breakdowns that are only possible with the videos. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope it wasn't too annoying hearing my voices. I hope the thumbnail got a chuckle out of you. And yeah, I hope that you have a wonderful time. Thank you for your time, and hope you tune in next time. Thanks. One other thing that I almost forgot to mention. If you are interested in more sort of detailed content about the GFL, I would heavily recommend Vampiric Legs. He's another content creator on YouTube. Has some really fantastic videos about the GFL. So, yeah. Check those out. Like and subscribe to his stuff too. Bye.